مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. إذا سألتم معظم الأمريكيين المثقفين عن موعد انتخاباتنا الرئاسية سيجيبون قائلين أول ثلاثاء يلي أول اثنين من شهر نوفمبر. ولكن لأن كل ولاية من الولايات 50 تكتب قوانين انتخاباتنا، لا توجد قواعد وطنية لهذه الانتخابات. في الواقع أكثر من 12 ولاية تسمح للمواطنين بالتصويت قبل شهر أو أكثر من انتخابات الفعلية. في سالف الأيام بدأت الحملة الحقيقية في مطلع شهر سبتمبر، وتزايدت الأثارة حتى نهاية أكتوبر. ولكن الآن سيكون ملايين من الأمريكيين قد صوتوا بالفعل، أما في صناديق الإلكتراء أو عن طريق البريد. بحلول الوقت الذي يبذل فيه المرشحين جهودهم الأخيرة قبل الانتخابات، وهذا يعني أن الوقت الحاسم من الحملة هو الآن. كيف ينفق المرشحين والحزبان الوقت والمال خلال هذه الأسابيع الحاسمة؟ هل أمام الرئيس ترامب ما يكفي من الوقت للتغلب على التقدم جو بايدن الكبير؟ ما هي الولايات الأكثر أهمية؟ أي مجموعات من الناخبين لها الثقل الأكبر؟ لمناقشة القرارات المحورية التي تتخذها الحملتان خلال هذا الوقت المهم، يسرني أن أرحب باثنين من معلقين السياسيين المخضرمين، وهما دانيال مارانس ونينا بيرلي. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. Well, there's 2 months to go, 2 months before our nation heads to the polls for what might be the most consequential election in modern American history. And to talk about where we are with just 2 months to go, I'm delighted to welcome Nina Bierly and Daniel Márans. Thank you for joining us today. So let's start with the Democrats. They completed their convention not too long ago, a virtual convention. What, in your view, ended up being the major themes they wanted to emphasize? And do you think that the convention provided the usual electoral bump that that conventioneers like to boast about? Daniel?
Thanks for having me, Robert. Well, I think we do have some information right now that helps us learn whether Joe Biden received a bump from the Democratic National Convention. There is a Reuters poll out today that shows that his polling has mainly remained stable, so it hasn't gone up or down. That's in a concrete sense. Obviously, when we look at what the goals of the convention were, it was to introduce Joe Biden once again to the American public. He's obviously a familiar figure as a former vice president, to show that he's the kind of unifying mainstream figure, somebody who can heal the country and rebuild after the coronavirus. And of course, also introduce Kamala Harris, the senator from California, who is Joe Biden's running mate. Another major theme of the convention, of course, was to try to disqualify President Donald Trump and really make the case that his divisiveness and his handling of the coronavirus in particular have been a big failure for the country.
So, Nina, do you think the Democrats mastered the virtual medium, and do you think they came across with the themes they hoped to achieve?
Yeah, I think they did master the virtual medium. I think they showed that it was masterable. I mean, the onus was on them because they were the first ones out of the gate testing this. Of course, they don't have the backdrop that the Republicans have with using the White House as a backdrop. And we can talk about that when we get to the Republican discussion. But yeah, I mean, I think they got a bump out of waiting to announce Harris as their vice presidential candidate. I think that was a day they got a little bump, but as Daniel pointed out, Biden hasn't really, he hasn't gotten, rocket fueled from it.
And Daniel, what do you think works best when you look at the Democratic strategy? Trying to highlight the idiosyncrasies of Donald Trump, or try to highlight the benefits, advantages of the Democratic alternative?
That's an interesting question, because if I were judging based on what occurred in the 2016 election, I would say that prosecuting a purely negative case against Donald Trump has limits, because we saw that Hillary Clinton tried to execute a very, very similar strategy. She ran television advertisements with children saying, do you want your children to hear what he has to say on TV? She spoke about somebody who sort of governs the nuclear arsenal by tweet and conducts foreign policy that way, painted the picture of a guy who is not responsible, who uses words loosely, and who would endanger the country as a result. And what we found in that election was that quite possibly because of negative opinions about Hillary Clinton as well, that wasn't enough to bring her over the finish line. Of course, Trump's margin of victory was incredibly narrow in the 3 states that clinched the election for him. Really, and of course, as many people note, 3 million more Americans ended up voting for Hillary Clinton in the popular vote, which is a distinction we can explain if you want. But at the same time, given the rules of the game, it did not work out. Now, many Democrats will say this time is significantly different, and I think there is no doubt that it is, because the negatives of Donald Trump are far more apparent. The potential negatives, things like the coronavirus, the economic decline and very dire situation for many American families. And I would even say some of the things that Donald Trump considers a strength for him, such as the rioting in some American cities, could be seen as a failure on his part because they're occurring on his watch. So I think that given past experience, you need more to go on than a negative case. But if Democrats are running heavily on a negative case, which is what they seem to be doing, the circumstances this time would seem to be more favorable for that.
And so, Nina, do you think that the Democrats will focus in the last 2 months on just the mechanics of getting out the vote in these key 3 states and elsewhere to get the marginal voters to make sure they cast their ballots for their side, or is there a bigger strategy to try to change the agenda and offer a big different alternative?
Well, I think that that's their challenge, really. That they, as Daniel pointed out rightly, if they don't have a clear agenda, a program other than getting this, crypto dictator out, as they're painting him, then they're going to have, I think, a problem getting energized. Is there enough anti-Trump fervor to get people out? It certainly was true in the 2018 midterms.
Before we go to the break in just a moment, I want to ask both of you one last question about the Democrats. 2 months to go. Some people are going to start voting in the next few weeks with early voting here in the United States. Is there one more Biden surprise, one more Biden announcement that we can expect that might attract major attention to seal the deal, if it will, for voters that the Democrats need to put them over the top? Nina, what do you think?
I don't see that coming. I think that their real focus is anti-Trump behavior, and I think what Trump does is the surprise.
Okay, Daniel?
Yes, I don't see a major surprise. We've seen a lot of the would-be surprises already. Of course, that includes the selection of Senator Kamala Harris of California as the vice presidential nominee.
All right, when we come back after the break, we're going to turn our focus on the Republicans and find out whether they have a winning strategy to overcome what looks like a substantial lead in the polls for Joe Biden in just a moment. My guests again today include Nina Burley. Nina is a New York Times best-selling author of 6 books, including her latest, The Trump Women, Part of the Deal. It's an in-depth analysis of the women who've had the most influence on the life of our president. An accomplished journalist, Nina has written for Newsweek, Rolling Stone, The New Yorker, Time, New York Times, and Slate. Delighted that she's joining us from somewhere in New York State. Also joining us today is Daniel Márens. Daniel reports on the politics, especially of the American Democratic Party and the progressive left, for Huffington Post. Before that, he worked for Al Jazeera America and was the policy director for Social Security Works, a Washington, D.C. based advocacy group. Thank you for joining us today, Daniel. Nina, let's start with you. What works best in your view for the Republican Party, focusing on, say, the foibles of Joe Biden or touting the successes of Donald Trump?
The idea that there are people, white people, outside of the cities, on the edges of the cities and in rural areas, who can watch video of riots and protests and then respond to them with fear and respond to Donald Trump as the law and order policing president. I think that works for them. So it's a kind of a balancing act, soften President Trump's appeal a little bit, but also make him look rock-ribbed and the guy who's going to protect you from these rampaging hordes in the video that's being traded around daily, by the thousands on Facebook and social media of what's going on in the cities.
Daniel, one of the common critiques one sees and hears at the Republican convention is that Joe Biden may be, the centrist, welcoming face of the Democratic Party, but he's really being controlled by the radical left, by the Sanders, Elizabeth Warren wing of the party, and he's really adopting their policies. Is this a legitimate critique? Has Joe Biden moved over that far to that side of the party? And do you think this is a winning critique for the Republicans?
I think anything is possible. And if I were the Republicans, I might be very well trying just about anything at this point to see what sticks and what works. But the left, the actual left, the sort of activist left, the people that came into politics during Bernie Sanders' candidacy in 2016, and in some cases before that, really spent a period of more than a year demonizing both Joe Biden and Kamala Harris as much too far to the right, and specifically on the issues of law and order and criminal justice. And that was factual on their part. Joe Biden in the 1980s and 1990s was at the very forefront of a Democratic Party effort to move to the right on issues of crime and law and order for political reasons, and to some extent for policy reasons, because the country was in the grips of much higher violent crime than it is now. And of course, they've rethought that, and Kamala Harris, who was a prosecutor in San Francisco and as the top prosecutor in California, also was part of that trend. And so I think that is one reason it makes it very hard to paint them that way. I think Joe Biden has been in American public life for, nearly 50 years. When he won his Senate race at the age of 29 in 1972, and he has never been on the far left wing of the party. Again, for all the reasons that progressive activists have been critical of him, for the fact that he opposed certain forms of racial forced racial integration in public schools, for the fact that he helped deregulate the financial industry, for the fact that he weakened bankruptcy laws, for the fact that he was a tough on crime architect of the laws that helped make America the country with the largest prison and jail population on planet Earth. So I think that's a tough sell, though I do agree with Nina that while the American public, according to polling, and I would say strongly as a reporter who's out in the field, anecdotally, the American public generally supports common sense police reforms, greater accountability in cases of use of lethal force. I do believe that the rioting that goes on is deeply unpopular and evokes bad images for people. Now, the interesting, and bad memories in many cases. Now, the interesting thing should be to see whether a president who is in power while the riots are occurring can say, give me more power in order to fix it. Normally, right, if these were occurring under a Democrat, it would seem to hurt the Democrat, but these are occurring under a Republican, and so that changes the math quite considerably.
So one of the key targets is something that you mentioned earlier, Nina, and that's the idea of the Republicans reaching out to women voters, perhaps just for that, on just that key issue of safety, security, et cetera. You've written an interesting book about the president's relationship to women. The Republicans have decided to highlight some of the women closest to the president, including a fascinating half-hour speech by the First Lady, Melania Trump. Is this a winning strategy? Did she hit the right themes that would appeal to enough women voters to make a dent in Joe Biden's lead in that regard?
I think maybe she can win back, some women who did vote for him. He did have a plurality of white women, not as high as was reported in 2016. The early exit polls, I think they had it in the 60% zone, 63% white women supporting Trump, which was astonishing. I think when they actually counted the votes at the end, it was much closer to like 57%, still more white women voting for Trump than for Hillary, but not as wide a gap as was originally described. And I don't think that he's going to get that this time around.
We only have a little time left. Let me just ask you both very quickly. One area of potential surprise in the last several weeks are the debates that the two presidential candidates will engage in. What's one thing that our viewers should look for in these debates? One wild card that may emerge that might be a key tipping point for the election. Daniel?
I would say the issue of United States trade policy and the United States' relationship with China. These are areas where I actually think that the president may have a slight advantage over Joe Biden, having renegotiated America's trading relationship with Mexico and Canada, as well as China, in ways that often many Democratic-leaning voters and constituencies, specifically in the industrial Midwest and in labor unions, in fact, appreciated and supported, including the largest labor federation in the United States, which endorsed his renegotiation of trading relations with Mexico and Canada. And of course, the role of China as a boogeyman, as a sort of cause or actor related to the coronavirus. And Biden on both of those issues has had a history of being more accommodating to China and more supportive of international trade. And I'm curious to see how he answers on that.
All right, trade and China. Nina, what else should viewers
I think it's just going to come down to, I with all due respect to Daniel and these details of policy, I think with these debates, it all comes down to how they look. And I think it's going to come down to mental acuity.
All right. One on substance, one on who projects best to the viewers. We'll be watching as September and October roll around. Thank you, Nina Burley, Daniel Márans, for joining us on Untitled Washington. I have always loved the post office. Maybe it's the idea of mail, that for a few coins you can buy a stamp, place it on an envelope, and send that item virtually anywhere in the world. It may go through 3 or 4 or 5 countries before it gets to its destination. And along the way, various clerks will do their job of getting your mail to where you want it to go, regardless of your politics or theirs, because that's the system to which we all agree. And the system works. Maybe not all the time, but what in this world works as well for just about 50 cents? I especially loved the post office in my hometown of Providence, Rhode Island, because it was historic in a positive, modern sense. It was featured in almost every elementary school textbook in America because it was the first modern automated post office in the country, something to be proud of. And there was something else that I was especially proud of. When I was growing up, the Postmaster General of my home state was a man named Harry Kazarian. Mr. Kazarian was the most decorated Rhode Islander of World War II, the most highly decorated Armenian American in our country. When I was 6 years old, my father introduced me to Mr. Kazarian at the post office, one World War II vet to another, except Mr. Kazarian had single-handedly killed 12 Japanese attackers while protecting a group of American injured servicemen all lying on stretchers. I will never forget shaking that hero's hand. So it was with great chagrin, though not great surprise, that our uber partisanship has finally found its way to the post office. Now, perhaps there are sound reasons why the Postal Service has become such a target of political infighting. Perhaps there is legitimate cause to withhold funding and changing the levels of service that the post office provides. After all, even progressive Senator Bernie Sanders has said, as a result of the digital age and the decline of first-class mail, there is no question that the Postal Service must change and develop a new business model, quote unquote. But in the weeks before a presidential election, when one side is urging citizens to legally use the mail to cast ballots as a way to avoid the danger of in-person voting, while the other side is casting aspersions on the legality of mail ballots and its susceptibility for fraud, largely unproven. Now is not the time for the Postal Service to change the way it does business. After some controversial statements, I was glad to see the Postmaster General affirm that. Let's recall the unofficial postman's motto, engraved into the marble above the great edifice of New York's General Post Office in Manhattan, right across the street from Madison Square Garden. And I quote, "Neither snow nor rain nor heat nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds." Words to remember during our election season. بهذا نصل لنهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول أثر فيروس كورونا على الحملة الرئاسية، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاج Inside Washington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سأراكم الأسبوع المقبل وإلى أن ألقاكم. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.